Hey everybody, John Flino here from Insightful Recordings, and today I'm going to be showing you the process I use to edit drums. Drum editing may come off as an intimidating process at first, but I can assure you that it isn't at all complicated once you get the basics down. As long as you have a general knowledge of rhythm, then you're good to go. A couple of quick disclaimers: you may edit drums differently than me already, or have seen a couple videos of people editing differently than me, but as with many things in the realm of music and audio, there is no real right or wrong. I've been using this process for 6 years and it hasn't really failed me yet. Also, a great drummer sounds great and a bad drummer sounds bad. Editing can only really change a drummer's recording so much. At the end of the day, when editing is complete, a good drummer will still sound better than a bad one. With all that being said, let's begin. I have a session here with 3 songs, each including raw tracked drums and bass and guitar DIs, which have already been edited, each with a rough tracking tone. As always, everything was tracked to a tempo grid so that we can properly align all instruments to each other. These songs are by a band called Becoming a Ghost, and the song that we're going to be working on right here is called How Low. Let's give it a listen right now in its current state. So, the drumming is played pretty tight. It's obviously a good drummer. He can do his parts well. And you may be asking, why do we need to edit? Well, I'm super picky, and if you zoom in, here's the snare drum right here. Here's where it should be landing. It's off by the tiniest amount. Now, some people might be fine with that. I happen to be not fine with it. I like everything to be super tight to the grid, and some people might say that's a bit too robotic for me or whatever, but honestly, I'd rather have everything perfectly in place than slightly out of place. Now, if you look here on my mix screen, I do have a couple plugins here on my drums already. Since I have 2 kick drum mics, I have a in and an out. On the in mic, I added a bit of a high pass and cleaned up the high end a little bit. And I also added a gate. On my hi-hat and both my overhead mics, I added a high pass up to 600 hertz. That way I don't have any of the low-end mud being picked up by the cymbals. I also on my snare bottom have this plug-in trim. It's usually used just to bring the gain down of a clip, but I use it for flipping the phase. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Now, there's going to be 10 steps to our process. The first of which is fading and consolidating your punch-ins. Second, phase correction. Third, match clip lengths and consolidate again. Fourth, move overheads to the stereo track. Fifth, edit toms. 6, create groups. 7, enable elastic audio. 8, begin quantization. 9, solutions for problems you might run into. And 10, disable elastic audio and commit edits. Again, this may seem like a lot, but each step is pretty simple in itself. And once you do this process a couple times, you'll have all this memorized and it will just come second nature to you. So right here, I've created a little spot where we had a punch in. The drummer played 2 different parts right here. He wanted to decide which one he liked more. So you can see we have a spot where the punch-in overlays with another take under it. What we're going to try and do is try and slide this clip that we're keeping here in the middle to a place with this other clip where playback between the two is seamless. You can't tell that there's a punch-in of any kind. Let's hear it right now. I'm going to solo the drums just so that we can hear it in better context. So you can see what's going on there. Again, our goal is to make it sound like there is no switching of clips in this area at all. So what we're going to do is try and find a spot where we can drag the beginning of this clip over to, where it would be a good spot to do a little crossfade, and hopefully you wouldn't be able to tell that there is any punch in at all. Let's listen back here a little bit. Now, right here, we have a gap of silence, which is really good. It makes this easy on us. So we could honestly just pull this clip back to right here before that first kick drum hit and just utilize a kick drum hit from the clip we're taking and try and get it as close as we can to the first hit of this measure. As you can see, we have a kick drum here and we have some cymbals, so I want to make sure I get everything. That looks pretty good. Let's listen to that. And honestly, right there, that already sounds good to me. But we're not done yet. We have to do the end of the clip as well. From the looks of it, he ended on the same hits with each take, so this should be pretty easy to work in together. Let's give that a listen. Yeah, the floor tom ties in seamlessly with the other take, so I think that's pretty good. Last step here is to fade and consolidate. What we're going to do is just highlight this whole track, and we're gonna do Control F, create fades, and we're gonna do create new fades. I'm just gonna leave adjust the existing fades off, and we're gonna make this a 1 millisecond fade, just so it's tiny, you can't even tell it's there. What that's gonna do is prevent any clicks or pops between this clip and that clip, and then this clip and that clip. And from there, we're going to keep them highlighted, and then Alt-Shift-3. That's going to consolidate your clips and make them into one final clip. And if we listen back, everything should be good to go. Can't even tell it was there. So, step 2, phase correction. Phase correction is pretty simple in itself. You just have to take it one mic at a time. The best way to think about it is any time you have multiple mics primarily picking up the same drum hit. For example, here we have 2 kick mics both picking up the kick. You have 2 snare mics both picking up the same snare. And then you also have the overheads, which are heavily picking up the snare. You really want all the hits being recorded by each of those tracks to be aligned with each other. Now, I said I put this plug-in on my snare bottom earlier just to flip the phase. I'm actually gonna get rid of this, and we're gonna be doing this differently. Let's start with the kick drum. If you look here, we have our kick in as the green and our kick out as the blue. I'm gonna switch over to slip mode so I can get exactly where I want. And you'll see the kick in actually picked up the kick drum a little bit earlier than the kick out, obviously because it was closer to the beater. Good way to think of it is whatever is closer to the origin of the sound, which would be our kick in, use that as the reference point of where all your other mics should be lining up to. We're gonna go to a good kick hit, and I really like this first one in the song. It just happens to be the first one. And we're gonna zoom in. We're going to click at the beginning of the sound, then press A to cut off the beginning of the clip. Then we're going to click and drag it over so that it lines up perfectly with the other mic. From there, you can drag the beginning of your clip back over. And if you look now, all our kick hits in the song are perfectly aligned with each other. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, let's listen to a little more exaggerated of an example. If we were to take our kick mics and put them heavily out of place, like, let's say something like that, let's hear what it would sound like. All right, you might be saying, okay, well, when would it ever be that far out of place? Well, if you think about it, even when it's slightly out of place, you're still getting that flammy effect, just maybe not as much. And if you can eliminate it completely, why not? Now with them perfectly aligned, it sounds a bit more like this. And undeniably, that sounds much, much better. Now, we're pretty much gonna do the same thing with the snare drum. We're gonna zoom in. Well, look what we have here. This is a little bit different. If I exaggerate the waveform size a little bit, you'll see that the snare top mic actually starts with waveform going downward, and the snare bottom mic starts with the waveform going upward. We can't have that. Reason being, when you have mics doing that, they create what's called phase cancellation. When you have 2 of the same sound, but opposite waveform polarity, it will cancel out frequencies, and you'll basically just get a crappier version of the sound. So what we need to do is flip one of these so that they have matching polarity, and then we won't be losing any frequencies at all. Let's find a good snare drum hit, and again, we have a great one right in the beginning of the song. It's super clear, easy to see, and we're gonna take the snare bottom mic and pull it back to be in line with the snare top mic first. Same process, we're gonna click on the beginning of the waveform, press A, and then drag it over. Zoom in just to make sure it's perfect, and then drag it back to the beginning. Next step is going to be making these polarities match. Now, you might be asking, which one do I flip? Well, considering that your snare top, your overheads, and your hi-hat are all coming from above the snare, and your snare bottom is coming from the bottom of the snare, your snare bottom is going to be the only one with its polarity flipped. So what we're going to do is just worry about flipping the polarity of the snare bottom. We're going to go up to Audio Suite, and we'll just take anything really, any basic plugin. They all have something to flip the polarity. We'll take this EQ one band, and we will just go over here. This is the phase flip button. You're just gonna hit that, and then press render. We're not even using the EQ, and all that does is just flip the waveform. Now we have 2 perfectly matching waveforms, and let's give it a listen. As opposed to you see, when polarities are opposite, the sound is much flatter and less appealing. You're losing a lot of the frequencies that make the sound full. And then when the polarities match, you get all the frequencies you want out of the drum. You'll notice that there's a lot more body. Now, like I said, we're gonna wanna actually align our overheads and actually our hi-hats too up to the origin of the snare sound. So what we're going to do is zoom into our hi-hat. We'll do that first. We're going to cut off the beginning of it. Ignore the toms for now. We're going to drag it over to the beginning of the snare, and then again pull your clip back over. We're going to worry about these clip length inconsistencies later on. I'll show you how to fix that. Now you might be saying, well, now aren't we sliding things out of time with each other? Well, you're moving these clips at such a microscopic length that really you're not going to notice any difference in timing. This is really just so that we're not losing any frequencies across the board. So now if we listen just hi-hat and snare mics, we have a full snare sound, no problems at all. Now we're going to take the overheads and we're gonna kind of align them with each other first. I'm gonna take the one that's getting the snare sound later, which is my overhead right, just by a little bit. We're gonna move it over so that it's perfectly in line with the overhead left. Gonna pull the end back over. Gonna zoom in, and we're gonna take both these clips and then line them up with our hi-hat because that is already in line with the snare. Got a little bit further to go. And if you want to check from up here, you can always click right at the top of the timeline and you'll get a line going all the way down. I want to see where the snare top actually starts. You can see it lines up pretty well, this little part of the waveform with this little part. Maybe we can pull these over a tiny bit more. That works for me. Cool. Now our phase correction process is complete. The next step, we're going to switch back to grid mode and we're going to actually zoom in on these clips. If you look, now that we slid everything out of place, you're going to see a little bit of inconsistencies in clip length. What we're going to do to solve that is just, I'll hold control, drag over the beginning of all these clips all the way up to the shortest one, and then just press delete. Now they all start in the same spot. We're obviously going to have clip length inconsistencies on this side as well. You'll see just like that. So what we're going to do here, we're just going to click our first track, then hold shift, click somewhere out here, and then while holding shift, press semicolon to go down and highlight the rest of our tracks. And again, we'll hit it with a control F just to prevent any pops, and alt shift 3 to consolidate all our clips. Now what you see is that all our clips are the same length on both ends, and that step is taken care of. Next, we're going to move our overheads to a stereo track. There's no real point in them being in two separate mono tracks at this point if you did a space pair like myself. So hey guys, really quickly, I just wanted to add in that I forgot a step here. Before continuing on, you might want to match the RMS or average peak volume of your overheads to each other so that neither side of the stereo overhead track will be louder than the other. To do so, you can analyze the RMS of each side using a plugin called Gain in the Other section of Audio Suite. From there, just bring down the clip gain of whichever side is louder so that its RMS becomes equal to the other side. Now, back to the video. I've already created a stereo track down here. We're just going to take both these, move them down there, and then we can hide and make inactive these two mono overhead tracks just in case we need them later for whatever reason. I'm also going to add a EQ back on this overhead track. Just going to take Q1 and throw it up to 600. I just can't stand cymbal mics with any low end in them, even if I'm just editing. So there, that's taken care of. Now the next step of the process is to go through and edit toms. This is probably the most tedious process of all, but it needs to be done. The actual process of this is taking out everything from the tom tracks that isn't an actual tom hit. So like all this nonsense here, everything in here you see between this tom hit and this tom hit, that's all just a bunch of noise. Let's listen right here. We have these tom tracks soloed out. We're gonna listen to this section. The problem with this is it's just going to be a ton of background air noise that we don't want at all, and it's also going to cause a bunch of phase issues at certain parts of the song, so it's better off just to get rid of it and not have to worry about it. What we're going to do is make sure you have tab the transient on, which is this button up here. What that does is that you can click in a track and press your tab button on your keyboard, and it will move to the next transient at anywhere in the track, and you're going to find your first tom hit. Let me make these a little bigger. You're going to find your first tom hit, tab to the beginning of it, press A, then go to the end of the hit. You might want to do this in slip mode. Press B, then click somewhere in the clip, add a fade with G, that fades from the end of the clip to wherever you clicked, and then you can keep moving on toward your next tom hit. Then we'll go over here, tab, A, click, B to cut the track, click in the middle track, G. Over here, tab A, B, G. Now, what do these sound like? Now, the length of which you create these fades is really up to you. I like to keep them super short. Some people like to have them really long, but the less of the other stuff that I can get in there as possible, the better. I'm going to get plenty of toms as well on my overhead tracks, so I'm not too worried about getting all the decay. It's still going to sound just as good. We're going to do this whole process for the entire track back and forth between our rack tom and our floor tom. It's going to take a little bit, but here we go. Just be really careful that you don't miss any. Like, these types of hits right here are very quiet, and you just have to be careful that you're not missing any of those hits along the way. All right, so there you have it. We have just edited out all the tom hits from the song. What we're gonna do is just click one of our full clips. We're gonna just click our snare bottom up here. Press semicolon to move down to your tom 1 track. Then hold shift, semicolon again to highlight both tom tracks. Control F, add fades to those clips. Since we already added fades to the end of each, it's really only adding a fade to the beginning of each, since we don't have it adjusting existing fades. And then we're just going to press Alt-Shift-3 to make each of those tracks into full clips. Now, as you can see here, we've lost all that junk in between tom hits. Let's listen to all of our drums soloed out, see what it's sounding like. It sounds super tight so far, and we haven't even done any quantization. Next step on our list is creating our edit groups. What we're gonna do here is actually just create 2 more. Since I already have a drum group, which is all my drums in one, what we're gonna do here is create one group for our kicks and one group for everything else. So we're gonna Control G, name this kick, and then we'll highlight the rest of these. Control G, we'll just call it other drums. So now we have a drum group with all of them, a drum group with just the kicks, and a drum group with other drums. Even if you only have one kick mic, make at least 2 separate groups so that you have a full drum group and then everything other than the kick. We're going to get into the reason for that later on. Next step in the process is turning on the actual thing we're going to be using to quantize the drums, which is elastic audio. That's this little thing right here. If you can't see that, it might be because your tracks are too small. So what you just got to do, hold Alt, drag down, and make your tracks big enough so that you can see that little icon right there. What you're going to want to do here is turn off your groups for a second. And what we're going to do is highlight everything except for the overheads. That's because we're actually going to enable a different kind of elastic audio for these than we are the overheads themselves. There's different algorithms. There's polyphonic, rhythmic, monophonic, and vari-speed. The ones we're going to be using is polyphonic and rhythmic. Rhythmic you use for things that really are just one pitch. Think about for your kick drum, like you're really picking up the kick. So we can use rhythmic there. Same with your snare. You're really going to focus on the snare. Each tom is really going to focus on one tom. You get the point. So we'll turn on rhythmic. I still have Alt-Shift held down, so I'll turn on rhythmic for all of them. You'll see all your tracks turn to gray. That's elastic audio actually analyzing the waveforms and creating a marker at the beginning of each of the transients. You'll see those in a second. And then just add polyphonic to your overheads. The reason we're doing that is because it's picking up a ton of different things, and they're all different pitches, so we want to account for that. Now just wait for your tracks to finish being analyzed, and once they're done being analyzed, we're ready to start quantization. Now turn your groups back on, and we're going to switch all our drum tracks to warp mode. Very first thing, very important, we are going to click somewhere in between waveforms on the track. We're going to right click and press add warp marker. What that does is adds a warp marker to the beginning of our clips and the end. You can see it there. What that does is basically creates a boundary of which our clips can't slide out of. We know we want our song to begin here and end there. If you don't have those enabled, I'll Control Z real quick, and let's see what happens when I just grab a random spot in here. We see the song ends right there. I'll grab a random spot and just start moving it. What you see happening to the right is everything from the song is just sliding out of place. And what that also does, it just moved our entire song all the way onto another track over there. And if I Control Z, it shows you how much it really moved out of place. When you add this warp marker to the beginning and end of the track, what it does is prevents that from happening. You see lots of movement here, but the end of our track doesn't move at all. Now, with that being done, we're actually going to start editing. Make sure you have your grid set to the minimum that you're going to need to align all the drum hits. You see we have a couple 16ths in there. Primarily these are lots of 8th notes. So we're gonna do an 8th note grid for now, and then when we get to the 16th stuff, we'll probably turn it on and off. The way we're gonna do this is you're going to hover over the bottom half of a transient on a track. Right here, our first hit is a snare drum. Now I say bottom half of the track because when you hover over the top half, you don't get your add warp marker cursor. So just make sure you're on the bottom half of the track, and you're gonna click and drag that drum into place. It will snap right to the grid, right to where you drag it to, wherever that may be, which in this case, it goes right there. If you need to remove a warp marker, just hold Alt, and then you'll see a little minus button pop up, and you can remove the warp marker. It will go back to where it originally was. Now, quantization basically just deals with lining up all your hits to the grid. Whenever you're grabbing a hit, let's say we have the kick drum here, make sure we're grabbing on the kick track. We have a snare drum here. We're not going to adjust it from the kick track because if you zoom in, now you look, our snare isn't aligned with our kick track. Our snare drum is actually hitting before the proper spot on the grid. So we're going to undo that and actually grab by the snare and snap it into place. Same goes for your hi-hat hits in between as well. The primary hit of this part right here is a snare, even though the hi-hat's hitting as well. So we're going to snap the snare into place, but then in between we have this hi-hat, so we're going to pull that into place as well. Then over here, our primary hit is the kicks, so we're going to do those, then snare, then we have a hi-hat. Kick, kick, snare, hi-hat, kick, kick, snare, hi-hat. And then we have a 16th note there, so I'll turn on my 16th note grid. Only reason I'm not leaving that on is because then you get a ton of extra lines, and I don't want to deal with that right now. And pretty much you're just going to go through the whole song, snapping all your hits into place, just like this. It is a very time-consuming process, but I highly suggest you don't just get too lost in clicking and not listening to what you're doing throughout the song. Always kind of every few measures, just go back and give it a listen. Make sure it sounds right. So that sounds great right now. And if we turn on the click right now, you'll actually hear that it's perfectly in time. Great thing about this too is we have no stretch sounds or artifacts or anything else to worry about, which you might have to worry about with other forms of drum editing. Elastic Audio does a great job at preventing this, and that's why I suggest using it. Now I'm just going to keep going through and doing a little bit more of this part of the song, just so that you can give it a good listen and hear the type of thing we're shooting for. Again, let's listen back. Everything is perfectly in time, and it's not ruining the drummer's performance. It's not causing any stretching sounds at all. I highly suggest doing it this way. What you're going to do is go through the entire song doing this. Now, I'm not going to sit here and do the entire song for this video because it takes an hour to 2 hours, depending on what your speed is, and I don't want to waste your time. But you may be asking, why did we make these separate groups for the drums? That brings us to our next step, which is one of the problems you might run into. Let's find a spot where the kick and the snare drum hit at the exact same time. Right here we have one of those situations. It's very hard for a drummer to hit a kick and snare at the exact same moment. What that does is, even though we're talking two separate drums, it creates a flam between the two, and you don't want that. So I'm just gonna edit around this area a little bit, just so that we have a little section to work with. Whenever you run into one of these situations, say I was editing over here, I'm like, oh, there's a kick and a snare landing on the same moment. I'm gonna edit everything up to that point and then a couple things after. So that basically we have it kind of boxed in around a bunch of edits. We're gonna turn off our all drums group, and then that gives us everything but the kick separate from the kick itself. And what we're gonna do is pretty simple. We're just going to snap them to the grid separately. That allows us to align them both to the grid without resulting in any sort of flam. And you don't really have to worry about maybe the snare being picked up in the kick mic and throwing everything off, because with an edit that small, you're not gonna really notice any of that. We're really just trying to get rid of any transient flam that you might hear. And then from that point forward, turn your all drum group back on and keep editing. Let's listen to what that did there. There's no flam at all between the kick and the snare, and I think we got a pretty good result. Now, obviously, that could happen between the kick and any other type of drum too. If you had a kick and a tom like you do right here, and you don't want any flamminess, I typically really enjoy the flam between a kick and a tom. I think it sounds kind of cool, but if it's too drastic, you could obviously turn off your groups again, throw your kick into place, then throw your tom into place, and it would solve your issue. Now to our last step. Let's say I edited this whole song. This whole song would be filled with the warp markers and look exactly like it does here. All these little black lines beginning to end. Definitely listen through your song a couple times. Make sure everything sounds exactly the way you want it to before you continue forward. Last step is going to be, with your all drums group on, go over and disable elastic audio. It's going to give you this little pop-up. Basically what it's asking you is, do you want to commit all these little edits you made and make them into new clips, or do you want to revert to the clip that you had unedited before all these edits? Obviously you want to press commit so that saves all your work, and you'll see the clips turn gray like this. Basically that's them turning into new clips, and now all your edits are committed. We'll listen back to where we edited in the beginning. And you'll see that all our edits are there, but elastic audio is off. Now you might be asking, why would you want to turn elastic audio off? Well, sometimes having a lot of tracks with elastic audio on can take up a lot of processing power from your computer, which you don't want happening, especially while you're mixing with a ton of plugins running. But now there you have it. Our drums are fully edited. All phase issues are taken care of. All our clips are the same length. Toms are edited. All hits are quantized to the grid. And if we listen to it alongside our other instruments, which, like I said, were already edited prior, it should sound pretty tight now. I think that came out pretty good, and I hope yours came out pretty good as well. Hopefully you found that the process wasn't that confusing. Like I said, even though it's time consuming, there's not really much depth that goes into each step of the process, and I think you'll find that having edited drums greatly separates an amateur track from a pro track. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope you got something out of this. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments, and I will be sure to answer any and all of them. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.